do so in a way which would not be unfair to anyone, take into account the contribution which has already been made by several countries, maybe by virtue by virtue of history, geography, but forests is an important element in the entire equation. And also, after Kyoto regime must be universal. We must take into account development needs of those countries who are lagging behind in their development compared to the golden billion. And Russia also wants, to have some faster development. So these needs must be taken into account, but at the same time, no one must be left aside as far as commitments to reduce the emissions are concerned. It's very easily said, not so easily done, but those are the principles which I believe are very close to the US position as well. It would have to be a very specific, difficult negotiations. Various specific schemes are being discussed, including voluntary self-restrictions by those countries who believe they have not yet enough time for the industrial development. But a compromise is possible, and I hope the Copenhagen conference would chart the waters towards the year 2012 in the way which is acceptable to all. And this is an important area of cooperation between Russia and the United States. And I would highlight also the Arctic region, where Russia and the US are two of the 5 Arctic littoral states, and also members of the 8-country Arctic Council, which recently held its ministerial meeting in Norway. It is very, gratifying that in the Arctic Council, the issues of climate change, the issues of the need to preserve the nature, which is very fragile over there, to preserve the environment where the indigenous people live, and at the same time to have opportunities for hydrocarbon development, other natural resources development. Those issues are discussed in a very constructive way, and I think we both, the United States and Russia, are interested in strengthening the cooperative spirit and cooperative practices of the Arctic Council. It's an important element of cooperation on the environmental issues.
Toby Gotti, you can go. Hello, Sergei, good to see you. The way you look at history is very important for moving forward, and I was struck by the way you described the period 1989-2009, and maybe you didn't mean to do this, but you seem to make a parallel between the foreign policy behavior of the United States and the behavior of the Soviet Union, which I think most Americans would reject. Well, in any case, what you didn't speak about was Russian foreign policy for these 20 years. Can I ask you a question? What is the lesson of Russian foreign policy for the last 20 years, and what do you have to reset?
Toby, I think you misheard me, because what I said was not compare the United States to the Soviet Union. I said the Soviet Union, in its economic model, took one extreme, socialism, which we even called communism at some point. And the United States, especially after the Cold War, took another extreme in economic development, being liberal capitalism. And both extremes proved to be, I said, insolvent. You can find a softer term for what happened to you. But in Russia, socialist system certainly was insolvent. What happened to liberal capitalism last fall, it's up to you to qualify. What lessons we draw, never thought of this, frankly. I don't have time to draw lessons. I would do this when I retire.
Right here.
Mr. Minister, welcome. Rich Harold with BP. I think it's fair to say that the business community is hoping for a healthier bilateral relationship between Russia and the U.S. for all kinds of reasons, but including self-interest, because for those of us working in Russia, we think that will provide a healthier working environment. One item that's probably important to a healthier relationship is an active multi-level dialogue between governments and other entities in both countries. And we've been hearing that talks are underway between Russia and the U.S. to establish such a dialogue. At this point, could you please give us your thoughts on what level you think in the Russian government should be leading the dialogue on your side, and how should the dialogue be structured? Thank you.
Well, this would have to be discussed by the presidents when they meet in early July in Moscow. We have had various formats, as you know. We used to have a Chernomyrdian-Gore Commission. In the last 2 years of the Bush administration, we have had a format which was at the level of first deputy foreign ministers, which met quite usefully, I would say. What will be the new format? The presidents would decide. I don't want to prejudge the agreement, but I can assure you that there would, and we paid attention to the need for both of us to encourage the business-to-business closer cooperation, and Russian and American business communities have more than 3, I think, structures which are quite active. And there would be an intergovernmental mechanism to support this business-to-business cooperation and to help resolve in operational way the problems which might arise for the two business communities.
All right, let's go to the back, right there on the aisle.
Hi, Mr. Minister. Miles Pomper from the Center for Nonproliferation Studies. You've called repeatedly for nuclear weapons to not be stationed outside of the territory of nuclear weapon states. And presumably that refers to U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in Europe and the withdrawing those from Europe. What would Russia be prepared to do if the United States moved on your proposal in terms of its tactical nuclear weapons? Would it be prepared to provide greater transparency, for instance, consolidate its tactical weapons, disclose how it's met its commitments under the presidential nuclear initiatives of 1991?
Try us, you wouldn't be disappointed. But I can only remark that the U.S. tactical weapons in Europe, for all practical purposes, are part of the U.S. strategic arsenal.
Graham.
Thank you very much. Graham Allison. Nice to see you, Mr. Minister. President Medvedev has on several occasions proposed a new European security architecture. He says about it that it's not to replace NATO, not to replace EU. It's to be open to the U.S. and Canada. It's not the OSCE. So would you tell us a little more about what the content of it might actually be?
Well, I alluded to this in my initial remarks. The problem is that we have a lot of principles endorsed in the context of all European cooperation under OSCE, under Russian NATO Council, in other formats. And these principles do not ensure security in this region. They could not prevent the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, including the bombing of media outlets, TV stations, even hitting an embassy in the process, you know. These principles and the mechanisms existing in security area in Europe could not prevent what happened last August in the Caucasus. In spite of the fact that we have been repeatedly calling, a couple of years before that crisis, calling for a non-use of force documents to be signed.